Hi everyone. Today I would like to introduce Dr. Michael Winkelman, Ph.D., author of numerous books on shamanism. Michael has conducted in-depth academic research on cross-cultural and cross-time shamanism. To learn more about his work, you can read his articles and his books. In this podcast, we talk about plant medicine and their role in human evolution. We also discuss the Stoned Ape theory proposed by Terence Mckenna and other fascinating things. I hope you find this conversation worthy of your time. Please subscribe to our channel to meet and learn from interesting guests. If you have a book written on shamanism, plant medicine, psychedelics, and personal transformation through them, and you would like to present to our community, please contact me at sergey@thankyouplantmedicine.com. Thank you, and see you soon.
So, hello, Michael.
Hello,
Good
Sergey.
to see you here. Thank you for coming.
Sure.
I just want to introduce you quickly. Michael Winkelman is the author of various books on shamanism, and one of the books that I came across was Shamanism, the Biopsychosocial Paradigm of Consciousness.
Of consciousness
I don't remember what was the subtitle.
and healing, consciousness and healing, a
And healing.
biopsychosocial
Yeah.
paradigm of consciousness and healing. So it tries to show how biology, social relations, and human psychology were all related in the creation of a worldwide shamanism that existed in the pre-modern world.
That's wonderful subject I love to talk about because it's also a subject that I write about too, but not from academic perspective like you, but from plant-based, like just, working with the medicine and thinking, and I just write about things that just interested to me. And what was interesting that I found a lot of resemblance between what I write and what you write from academic perspective. And I thought we could talk about this, and it can be an interesting discussion.
Okay.
So maybe we can start from, maybe you can introduce yourself to our viewers, like maybe you can tell us about your career, your research, your field work, your medicine work, whatever you feel like sharing.
Okay. Well, my career did not start off very promising. I thought I was going to be a physics major. But in my freshman year of college, I started doing LSD and psilocybin, and only later understood that that doesn't combine very well with thinking the way physicists have to think and doing calculus. But it opened other doors for me. I got exposed to Carlos Castaneda and started getting intrigued with the whole idea that these plants open up a different reality, a different way of seeing the world. And even long before I was trying to do this as an academic, I would go over to the medical school libraries there in Houston. I was at Rice University. I'd go there and read the studies about how does psychedelic substances interact with the brain. What are they doing? How can we understand the experience, the phenomenology of shamanism and psychedelic experiences from the point of view of neurology? What is it that they're doing in the brain that gives us a different perspective on the world? At that time, I was, at a very basic level because our science about the effects was at a basic level, but I came to appreciate that much of what was being discussed in the anthropological literature, even to some extent in Carlos Castaneda's books, could be understood in terms of how psychedelics and meditation and altered states of consciousness change the ways in which we perceive the world, because they change the kind of information that we received. So from a sort of, personal experience, I eventually wandered into psychology and eventually into anthropology with the interest in trying to understand, how is it that we end up with these remarkably similar phenomena in cultures around the world. I was intrigued with this notion of the shaman, the idea that somehow a religious figure that presumably, according to most academia, should be these culturally specific idiosyncratic practices. How was the shaman so similar in cultures around the world, in the pre-modern world? And so this led to my dissertation research. I went out to the University of California, Irvine, and ended up, after a few years of trying to figure out how I wanted to approach this topic, I ended up moving away from the ethnographic perspective, moving away from participating in ceremonies and trying to understand it from a cultural point of view, to trying to understand it from a transcultural or cross-cultural point of view. And the basic question that I engaged, although my methodology took me much further, was, does this concept of a shaman have some basic similarity in different cultures? Is what they call a shaman in the Kung Bushman the same thing as a shaman among the Tupi-Guarani people, the same thing as a shaman of the clever men of Australia, the same thing as a shaman in Siberia? Or are these just totally different things and people are just making up this idea that a shaman exists? So my approach was a formal cross-cultural study. I used a subsample of the standard cross-cultural sample, which is a collection of 186 societies used by anthropologists to test hypotheses about what's universal, what's culturally particular. Do child raising practices have anything to do with adult personality? Does the type of economic system you have any relationship to the kinship system? So I had this standard database that I could call upon for looking at all kinds of social, political, economic variables. And my dissertation was studying the religious variables. So I knew that I couldn't just go study things that were called shamans, because anything can be called a shaman. And in many cases, practitioners who may well deserve to be called shamans might be called something else, like a medicine man or a medium or a fake even. So my dissertation approach was creating a bunch of variables. I ended up with well over 100 variables that were like descriptors of what religious practitioners were like. How were they selected? How were they trained? What kind of activities did they do? What kind of social powers did they have? How did they get their supernatural power? Where did they, go to learn the skills? How did they heal? So basically descriptors. And then I turned all these descriptors into basically data variables by reading ethnographies and coding this. So I ended up with well over 100 variables that characterized 117 practitioners in 47 societies. So my next phase was, now I have this database, now I have to turn to statistics. And my question was, what are the types of practitioners? Are there practitioners that are basically the same, even though they're in different societies? And the approach I took was called cluster analysis. To give you an analogy, if I gave you a big pile of fruit, all different kinds of fruit, and say, okay, put these things together that are alike. Well, most people, they put the oranges with the tangerines, with the grapefruits, because these are all citrus. They'd put peaches and they'd put plums and they'd put other kinds of stone fruit together because they're fruits that have stone in the middle. They actually are part of a botanical classification. And you'd put the watermelon and the cantaloupe and the other kind of melons together in groups because they share similarities. Well, there's mathematical procedures to do this. And so basically, I put my data through these programs to give me types of religious practitioners, groups of practitioners that shared empirically the same kinds of features. And what I did discover is, yes, there were shamans that were found in cultures around the world and that they had these fundamentally similar properties. I also discovered that there were different kinds of practitioners. For instance, a group that I called the mediums. A lot of people call them shamans, but they don't get their power from animals. They're not the leaders in their group. They don't do vision quest. They don't have out-of-body experiences. They don't turn into animals. They don't use their powers to kill. They're distinctly different from shamans. So the first level of analysis, but what are the different types? And then I'll go on from there unless you want to get me to clarify something at this point.
Oh, it's very good. Please continue. I will ask you a question when I feel like.
Okay. And so then the next question was, what are the characteristics of these different groups? So I went back, to the variables themselves and say, okay, this is one group that comes out of the cluster analysis. What are its features? Here's another group. What are their features? With another group, okay, what are their features? Here's a group that they, inherit their positions. They're social and political leaders. They, run the society. They have control of the economic system. They organize the agricultural cycle. They, hold harvest festivals for the high gods. Here's another cluster of practitioners, and here's a list of features. Well, these are priests. They're different than shamans by a long shot. But there's also more intermediate cases. So, for instance, the cluster analyses didn't always give exactly the same groups because there's lots of different procedures you can use to measure similarities and differences. So I had this one group that clustered together that was sort of like what I ended up calling the shamans. And then they had another group that sometimes was clustered with the shamans and sometimes they were clustered with a group I called the healers. So, okay, what's the difference between the shamans, the shaman healers, and the healers? Both in terms of the characteristics, but to me, more importantly, in terms of what kinds of societies are they found in? And what I discovered was that the group that was what I labeled shamans, the type, the empirically derived group, well, these were in hunting-gathering societies. Sometimes they had a little bit of agriculture, but they weren't agriculturalists. They didn't have complex, political institutions. The shaman healers, the second group, they're almost always in agricultural societies that rely upon intensive agriculture. And then the healers are in agricultural societies with complex political structures and other features associated with complex societies. So I went from the question of, does the shaman exist as an empirical phenomenon? Yes. To the where are shamans in terms of types of societies on a range of sociocultural evolution? And so what I eventually was able to do is to show that shamanism evolved, that it was transformed as a consequence of the changes that occurred because of intensive agriculture, because of warfare, and because of the development of highly integrated societies, hierarchies. So my second phase of research was then the social organization of magic and religion. But what my true interest was, and what I spent most of my career on, and what is really the core of the shamanism book, is a response to the question of why. Why do you end up with remarkably similar practices in societies all around the world? How come a shaman in Siberia is basically the same thing as a shaman in Africa, is the same thing as a shaman in Australia, is the same thing as a shaman in South America or North America? Why do we have these cross-cultural features? Not true universals, they're not in all societies, but it's the same basic phenomena in different cultures. And so my path was led into understanding the biological nature of shamanism, because if we have features that repeatedly occur across societies like this, they have something to do with human nature, something to do with our intrinsic biological properties. And so studying the plant medicines, the psychedelics, and understanding the biology of psychedelics and altered states of consciousness was the beginning of my path of creating this biopsychosocial model of shamanism. How it is that underlying biological features are manipulated by ritual practices. And so the first thing that I really paid a lot of attention to were the alterations of consciousness. What happens when you sing and drum and dance all night long? How does it change the way your brain functions? What happens when you fast for days or weeks? How does that change your brain function? And across time, I've put together a general biological model of altered states of consciousness. In fact, most of the time I prefer not to use altered states, because what I want to talk about is actually something much more fundamental. Because altered states can vary, but what most most altered states of consciousness share in common is what I have called the integrative mode of consciousness. I use the term mode as a natural form that consciousness takes. So for instance, if you study the consciousness of other animals, well, sometimes they interact with the external world, they're awake, and sometimes they're asleep. Different modes, and we can explain biologically how these two modes emerge. With mammals, when their mammals are asleep, they can be in two very different functional modes. They can be in deep sleep or they can be in REM sleep, dreaming sleep. So mammals have the waking mode, the dream mode, the deep sleep mode. Well, humans added a third mode, and I call it the integrative mode of consciousness, because what I understand as the overall dynamics of the brain under these kinds of conditions of the altered state experiences of shamans is that we're getting a highly driven integration, powerfully driven integration in the brain of what we would normally call unconscious material. And this overall dynamic of the brain is exemplified not only by psychedelics, but by drumming and chanting and singing and dancing and fasting and particular kinds of psychological dispositions and extreme stress, etc. Now, what happens to the brain under all these conditions is that the normal control centers of the brain, what we call the prefrontal cortex, as well as the default mode network, that sort of keep us focused on the external world and our relationship to the external world, these parts of the brain are debilitated, shut down by the psychedelics, by meditation, by drumming, by dreaming, etc. And a new mode of information processing emerges. And the simple way to talk about this is that normally the brain is top down. The top parts of the brain control the rest of the brain and even our experience. The big part of the frontal part of the brain is to shut off most of the information available to us. So for instance, before I say this, you probably had no sense of awareness of how your butt feels. As soon as I say, how does your butt feel? Oh, you get sensations from your butt. But most of the time, how your butt feels is irrelevant. And so the brain squashes that. What happens in these alternative modalities of consciousness, this integrative mode, is that the brain shifts from top-down control to bottom-up control. The repressors are removed, and the brain's intrinsic information system starts to function. And it functions through circuitry that's basically a serotonin circuitry that starts in the mid parts of the brain, goes down to the reptilian brain, and then loops back up. And it's a theta wave frequency. So this frequency is what's set off in these alternative states of consciousness, and it enables the information that's normally repressed, that's brought into the lower brain systems but repressed, is allowed to emerge and to move up through the brain. And so this becomes the dominant focus of brain activity in this integrative mode of consciousness, an integration of what I would call the reptilian brain and the paleomammalian brain into the frontal brain. And so under these conditions, people are now able to experience the world through a set of cognitive capacities that emerged millions and millions of years ago, and that were the major form of consciousness until we developed these highly complex frontal lobes that we program with language and cultural information. So my first step in understanding the universals of shamanism was understanding the universal bases for the alteration of consciousness. And psychedelics exemplify this kind of effect, where they disable the prefrontal cortex, they disable the default mode network, and they stimulate this hippocampal septal system from the midbrain down to the reptilian brain, and these cortical striatothalamic loops that bring the information up to the frontal brain. And so it's a very powerful dynamic that then dominates consciousness. And we've all experienced this in various forms. You probably experienced it sometime when it really bothered you. You're trying to read, you're trying to study, you're trying to pay attention to somebody or something, and someone 2 houses away has got the stereo going boom, 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 boom. And you go, I can't think with this noise. And you can't. Why? Because it's driving these ancient brain systems that aren't part of what we consider to be normal cognition, normal thinking. But they do have other forms of thinking. And we can talk about this as a behavioral thinking that's manifested in ritual, and an emotional and social thinking that's manifested in the healing dynamics of shamanic ritual. So that's the first part of the biological model. We can take questions from you, or I can go on to other parts.
Okay. Well, it's very interesting. Obviously, we can talk a lot about this subject. What's interesting here is that it resonates with my own understanding that I wrote about in the second book, The Masculine Confession. I came to realization that when I take medicine, I work specifically with Wachuma, with San Pedro cactus, if you're aware of it. Yeah. When I take the medicine, it takes me to a place inside my consciousness. That's how it feels. A place, a part of my brain that feels very archaic, you know. It's a place, a pre-linguistic place. It's a place where language wasn't even there. You know, this is what resonates in your writing, because it really felt like I got to that through my experience, and it's very similar. Maybe I don't understand the whole thing yet, but I'm trying to understand right now, talking to you. So when you are there, you think, like, I don't think in words anymore at all. Like, people ask me, like, how do you think? In which language do you think? I speak 4 languages, you know. So I say that I don't speak in language anymore. I mean, I don't think in words anymore. You know, my thinking process is like, it's imagery. It's exactly. Visionary. You know, I only reach into the world, translate my imagery thinking into the words. When I want to write, when I want to speak to you, like, I'm reaching down into the words like a toolbox. Words is a toolbox for me. But if I don't have to do this, I don't think in words. It's images. It's like I'm looking at the mountain now. I don't translate that into this is the mountain, this is the altitude, this is Sacred Valley. To me, it's different. It's unexplainable. And that's the place where medicine takes me there. This is where I actually dwell in the medicine. And only when there is a need, I use it. So if this archaic brain, or this is like part of our consciousness, I don't know where it is exactly, like geographically, you know, where is it in the head? But it's a place. It's actual place where you can dwell and you can see the world differently, which is pretty linguistic, which brought me also to an idea that this was before we developed the language, and that resonates with the idea that shamanism was, you know, the first religion, because it's like it makes sense that the primitive man would stumble upon psychedelic plants and substances and would develop a different kind of cognition. It's very much, it resonates with the Stoned Ape theory by Terence Mckenna. I'm sure you know that. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think about Stoned Ape theory? Maybe we can talk about this and how that, you know, resonates with your work, with my understanding, and you know, to get to the bottom of it.
Well, I mean, you know, Terence Mckenna, when he wrote Stoned Ape theory, was basically developing a theory derived from his personal experiences and observation of other people, and an observation of what was being done in various cultures that used the psychedelics. He didn't have the advantage that we do, you know, 30 years later, of all this, you know, generation of clinical research that's been done on how the psychedelics affect the brain. But I think that, you know, Terence was right on in terms of the ideas he had about how psychedelics would have necessarily influenced the course of human evolution. I have a recent article that just came out in Frontiers Ethnopharmacology. That's the first part of my sort of updating of Terence's idea. I think it's called The Evolved Psychology of Psychedelic Set and Setting. So what was the natural context in which our brains began to adapt to these environmental influences that were enhancing a lot of different kinds of process? And what these plants did, and I'm working on the second paper now that has to do with their sociality aspects, but the first thing that they did was they enhanced a certain kinds of information system, the visual information system. And it's been discussed off and on in philosophy and a little bit in cognitive science, but cognitive science looks at words, not at images. I can ask you what you said and you can tell me what you said, but I can't ask you what you saw and have you show me what you saw. We don't have that capacity to share those in the same way, although some people say it happens when you're on the plant medicines. But the first thing that happened was this enhanced visual representation capacity. And what we know about some of the major brain dynamics of the psychedelics is that they enhance the long distance connections between parts of the brain that are normally not connected. So instead of the habitual connections of the salience network or the task-oriented network or the default mode network, we have what some people have said is an anarchic brain. But someday I'm going to write an article countering that point of view. The brain's not anarchic, it's archaic. And what's happening is that the parts of the brain that are sort of innate modular structures for things such as vision and visual representation, or for music, or for perceiving an entity, or for inferring people's thoughts. It's these archaic parts of our brain that are being not only stimulated, but they're being connected and linked together. Normally our innate intelligences are like, the Swiss Army knife. You get your Swiss Army knife out, you got 10 blades, but you only get to use one blade at a time. And what the psychedelics do is they bring them together. They link them all up. They merge them. So now we get not just animals, but animal identities. We get just not animals, but social groups identified by animals. We get not just mental capacities or communication capacities, but we get these communicative entities that want to tell us something. So to me, much of what we can understand about the evolution of the brain vis-a-vis the effects of psychedelics is that they enhance the integration of individual processing capacities. So back to this notion of psychointegration and the integrative mode of consciousness. You're getting these different capacities linked together, and what that provides is symbols. So this was, I think, the part that Terence may have alluded to a little bit, but didn't really fully appreciate, was the notion that psychedelics were stimulating this symbolic capacity by enhancing our abilities to re-represent in the visual mode. And one of the things we know about the human brain in comparison to the chimp brain is that we have much greater interconnectivity among the different areas of the visual region and between the visual regions and other areas of the brain. So what was it that humans entered into as an environmental influence that would have enhanced the selection for brains that have better capacities for transmitting visual signals? We are in the physical environment. We had the same challenges and opportunities as chimpanzees, monkeys. They have good visual systems, very similar to humans. But what's different about the human system is the interconnections in the brain. So what that says to me is that the evolution of the human capacity to symbolize was based upon selection for an enhanced ability to create within our own brain symbols, models that allow us to work on the external world. We represent it in here and then could project it out to the external world. Of course, Terence had a number of other ideas about psychedelics and human evolution. This is the paper I'm finishing up now. We have a special issue of Frontiers Pharmacology that's going to be out later this year. The title of it is Psychedelic Sociality. How did psychedelics affect the way that we related to one another? And this may be even more important than the whole dynamic of the visualization and symbolization, because what really distinguishes humans from our chimpanzee relatives is that we function within a cultural niche, within a system of representation that we learn from others and share with others, and use this as our adaptation to the environment. I think it can be stated unequivocally that humans don't relate to the environment. They relate to their models of the environment. And these models are learned, acquired in the process of socialization. So how do we get to be socialized? Well, the first thing we have to do is reduce aggression among members of the species, particularly aggression between males. So the psychedelics have this tendency to reduce fear responses, reduce aggressive responses, enhance empathy for others. There's lots of studies out there that show the psychedelics enhance openness to new experiences, openness to others, openness to new ideas. They enhance extroversion, this sense of being more sociable and relating to other people. So to me, this is the other big dynamic that the psychedelics served as an environmental influence, selecting on ancient hominin populations for enhanced capacities at being social, and hence learning culture and sharing information and creating models of the world that we use for everything from building tools to exploiting food. Now, there's a third dimension that I would point to too in terms of the evolution of humans vis-a-vis the effects of psychedelics, and this is this whole exploding field that we see these days of the important therapeutic applications of psychedelics, in particular psilocybin. That there's studies that indicate that treatment-resistant depression, you're on psychiatric medications for 5 or 10 years and nothing works and you stay depressed, and you go do one session of psilocybin and you're like, whoa, I'm feeling better than I have in years, We don't have long-term follow-up. My suspicion is that these people who are chronically depressed are going to have to keep on doing a psilocybin dose every 6 weeks, 3 months, a couple times a year to go back and reset the serotonergic system. We've got other things like, post-traumatic stress disorders that apparently respond well to psilocybin. We're probably eventually going to get expanded data on the effectiveness of psilocybin in dealing with addictions. And who knows where all of this is going to lead. And I say this in part because the psychedelics, the classic psychedelics, they're also referred to as the 5-HT2. That is to say, the ones that operate on the 5-HT2 neuroreceptors. These activities seem to stimulate a whole wide range of therapeutic responses. And these effects may have begun long before humans ever began to deliberately use them for healing ceremonies. Just incidental consumption could have brought about adaptive responses. And one of the things that is, to me, particularly interesting and compelling, an article by David Nutt and Robin Carhart-Harris a couple years back pointed out that there are 2 major 5-HT2 response systems in the body. And that both of them are stress management systems. But one of them is a passive stress management system. It helps you just put up with difficult situations. But there's the second one, the 5-HT2A, and this receptor system is an adaptive, flexible stress response system that has the tendency to either change your behavioral responses, or change your attitudinal orientations, or change your emotional responses. The psychedelics stimulate this adaptive stress response mechanism. And so this feeds both into the general therapeutic effects in stress reduction. It feeds directly into enhanced sociality, ability to relate to other people. And since it's also mechanisms that stimulates modeling new ways of dealing with stress, it feeds directly into this whole notion of the cultural niche, which is to say, how do we create new models of the world that make us more effective at dealing with the problems? So to me, those are sort of like 4 major ideas about where Terence McKenna was fundamentally right. And hopefully about a year from now, I'm going to have a book that's going to be called Stoned Ape Facts. It's not a theory. We got lots of facts to back up the notion that psychedelics were key elements in the evolution of human cognition, sociality, healing, and interpersonal relationships.
I think it's very, very important, actually. This kind of work is very important because this can be used in legislation. We can bring this into we're taking this from the realm of tripping. This is not just, we're not doing drugs here. This is sacred medicine that not only have therapeutic value, that's obviously, we can prove it left and right with thousands of cases, but it goes beyond that. It has evolutionary capacity. And if it's already happened before, if it brought us to the stage of, from a monkey into human, using it consciously, who knows what is the new stage we can move into, And I speak about like spirituality here. It's like on a global scale, like a new stage of evolution could be enlightenment for humans, And
Sure.
we can reach there using these plants. And this is very important. That's why we need to push towards, because it's not just about your and my healing. It's about evolutionary of the species. It's about surviving and becoming wiser and more intelligent. So it's very important that you're talking about the
Yeah.
Stone Ape fact. So basically, you concur with his. I just want to clarify that you concur with his theory that it holds water, that in this case, mushrooms, or could be other plants, brought us to a new level of consciousness. You agree with that?
For certain.
Right?
And I think one of the interesting things is that there's lots of people in evolutionary biology that have written about the effects of what they would call exogenous neurotransmitter sources in human evolution, which is to say, there's plants out there that have precursors that are basically capable of interacting with the dopamine system or with the other neurotransmitter system, serotonin, et cetera. And there's all kinds of arguments about how this was adaptive. There's evidence that our own ability to sort of assimilate neurotoxins is much better than that of the chimpanzees or monkeys. That we evolved the capacity to effectively turn what are plant toxins into neurotransmitters. And these major evolutionary biologists, evolutionary anthropologists will talk about, the effects of stimulants or the effects of relaxants, et cetera, in human evolution, as if, this is not controversial. What they don't want to touch, though, is what are the implications for the psychedelics? And the psychedelics have far greater implications because they're basically acting on the serotonin system. And serotonin system is arguably the most important neurotransmitter system in the body for a couple of reasons. First, because it's a neuromodulatory system in addition to being a neurotransmitter system, which is to say it modulates dopamine, it modulates epinephrine, it modulates all these other neurotransmitter systems. So it's sort of like a master neurotransmitter system. And secondly, serotonin plays roles in waking and sleeping and dreaming and emotions and behavior and learning and adaptation and emotional stability and just a whole range of cognitive processes. So it's got a lot of different potentials for altering how it is that humans function. And of course, this is not a secret, really. I mean, people used to whisper, everybody in the Silicon Valley is microdosing, And then the truth comes out, no, they're not microdosing. They're doing big doses every once in a while. This is where big insights come from, So when we start to engage with an understanding of how psychedelics contributed to human evolution in the past, it is as you have said, it's not just about the past anymore. It's about their potentials for the present and the future. And of course, the therapeutic potentials that they're opening are just the beginning of understanding what, in fact, these plants can do for us. Tom Roberts, who has been involved in psychedelic studies for a couple of decades, he's addressing these as cognitive enhancers. How do they increase our capacity to engage in certain kinds of cognitive processes? And of course, the simple answer is they enhance our capacity to integrate information out of the unconscious and via visual symbols transmit them into consciousness. So they're a tool for the future as well. One of the things I wish I could do is, wherever you got, civil wars and, this long-going Palestinian, Israeli conflict, can we get these people to sit down and drink ayahuasca together? Can we get them to sit in the same room together and come to appreciate each other's point of view?
100%.
We got to try it,
That's my point all along. I think all politicians should be taking medicine before taking office. We would definitely have a better world. It just brings you to a whole new level from which you can actually understand that, the system of value.
Well, you say have all of our politicians take them. I'm not sure that all of them take them. Anytime you're going to apply psychedelics, you got to screen, your potential candidates. And not everybody's a good candidate. I think, people with, narcissistic personality disorders or sociopathic tendencies, no, I don't think you're a good
Not
candidate.
good candidates, but we need to do something about it. I mean, we can't just, there will be no world to live in and to do research on consciousness if there will be no humans left on this planet,
Right.
Let me ask you this question. That's the question I was also thinking about, just for me to understand. So, what do you think? Did the plant waited for us to evolve so we can assimilate them into our experience, or we actually evolved with it, like with their help, and then as we grew, we could do it better? I mean, obviously the plants were here before us.
Right.
They were here already fully evolved. Ayahuasca, Wachuma, peyote, they were evolved plants, but we were not evolved. We were not receptive. We didn't have receptors then. So is it like plants were waiting for us to evolve, like 40,000 years or so we can actually work with them? Is that were the plan, or it just happened in a different way? What do you think?
Well, I don't think that understanding the role of psilocybin, and I'll just stick to that because that's the easiest example, in human evolution requires any sentience on the part of the fungi. I mean, I understand animist perspectives more from a neurological point of view rather than as a true believer. So I don't feel that we have to bring in this notion that there was a plant consciousness waiting for us to encounter it. It was that we had to evolve to a certain level of complexity before that kind of effect upon our consciousness could be effectively integrated into our behavioral, emotional, social, cognitive repertoires. So, for instance, if you take monkeys or chimpanzees and put them in laboratory conditions, they will self-administer cocaine, they'll self-administer amphetamines, they'll self-administer nicotine and opiates and alcohol to the point of killing themselves. But as soon as they figure out what lever doses them with psychedelics, they are like, I am not doing that again. Okay? So their brains aren't evolved enough to experience a benefit from these influences of exogenous neurotransmitter analogs. So yes, we needed to evolve to a certain point at which the effects of these substances could be effectively incorporated into culture. And we can look at a lot of different ways in which that incorporation might have occurred. I think in the beginning it was just incidental effects. And it's only across time that they began to become ritualized and deliberately used, for instance, for healing. But apart from any intentional effect, I think that these plants began to exert an influence on our adaptations because they reduce stress, they reduce fear, they enhance openness, they made us more, agreeable to other people, and eventually they enhanced our representational capacities and integrated information for us in new and novel ways that allowed us to adapt to environmental problems. And I think that this became particularly important once we began to be cultural and we had models of the world. And one of the difficult things that a lot of animals face is that when they learn something, it's hard to go back and try to learn a whole new way of doing something. We have a saying in English, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. The dog's established in its way and it's not going to change. I think ritual and altered states of consciousness and the psychedelics were tools for changing our mind and changing the ways of being to allow us to adapt new solutions, new cultural means of addressing environmental problems and social problems.
How would you explain the appearance of sacred plants on this planet? Which, looking from the bigger perspective, like from the whole places in the universe, from the whole trillions of stars and systems, there is one little tiny planet on which different life forms exist, human, and plants and other life forms, but we are different than plants, organically. And how you explain such an incredible 100% compatibility, physiological and psychological? It's like we are meant to be together. We are built for each other. I don't see this as an accident. It's just too complex of an experience to to discount that or as an accident, cosmic accident.
Well, I mean, it wasn't an accident. And I won't try to address the whole question about the evolution of diversity, but I'll just address the very specific question about how we have a compatibility between these sacred plants, sacred fungi, and our brain. It's deep evolutionary history going back into the mammalian line is that plants evolved herbivore defenses. Plants developed defenses that would keep other animals from eating them. And those defenses were neurotoxins. And by selective processes, the neurotoxins were designed to disable the mental processes of the animal. But herbivores also developed countermeasures to plant defenses. And these countermeasures are enzymes that allow the animal to deactivate the parts of the molecules that produce the toxic effects. And so then not only human evolution, but mammalian evolution, primate evolution was a series of adaptations that allowed us to become more competent at removing the toxic parts of these substances that were designed to be defenses and dissuade us. And then in doing that, our adaptations enabled us to take what were evolved mechanisms, toxins on the part of plants and fungi, and turn them into neurochemicals that serve certain advantages.
So it sounds like, from what I understand, it's evolutionary processes, like blind processes, not like intelligent plant here with the plants, and together we evolve into higher states of consciousness. Is that right? Is that how do I understand you correctly? Is it more like mechanical processes or intelligent?
Well, I mean, it's a mixture of two. I mean, I guess I would start off saying that, I don't think that the plants or the fungi had an intention of helping us evolve. I mean, their intention, if they had any, was to keep from being eaten. So they produce toxins to keep from being eaten. We want to eat the plants, and therefore those members of our ancestral species that had genetic variation that enhanced their ability to deal with plant toxins were more likely to survive and reproduce. The proto-shaman who could use the psychedelics and have a vision and see what needed to be done to save the group was going to have lots of chances to reproduce and leave his genes. And so I don't see that we need any kind of deliberate intention on the part of the animals or the fungi. And to a certain extent, we didn't even need any intention on the part of humans. We had a saying in college, Nancy Reagan used to say, drugs are for people who can't handle reality. And we said, reality is for people who can't handle drugs. That drugs enable us to adapt to reality in certain kinds of ways that make us more successful. They make us, stimulated and focused when we need to be focused, and they give us, enhanced cognitive abilities when we need to solve problems, and then they give us an enhanced ability to relax afterwards. And if we took too many stimulants, they'll even put us to sleep in spite of the fact that our body's still running on amphetamines. So the ability to use drugs expanded our window of opportunities for adaptation. And so it didn't require a conscious, deliberate kind of effort on the part of humans. I think that we were, in a sense, underwent environmental selection for members of our ancestral species that were better able to use drugs in positive, constructive, socially adaptive ways.
I want to share with you this feeling that I have often on the medicine. I feel that when I ingest the cactus, I feel like there is a certain exchange between my consciousness and cactus consciousness, And I feel like as much as I like to see the world through its eyes, it likes to see the world through my eyes. It's like the cactus likes to experience reality through humans. It's enjoying this experience as I'm enjoying to be in it and seeing the world through this lens. It's like sometime I'm not even sure anymore if I'm a human who is having a cactus experience, or I'm a cactus who's having human experience.
Well,
it's totally in together. So I just feel like there is a certain, I don't know if that's intent, but there is certain desire in plants to experience the world, reality through us. It's some kind of symbiosis that has to happen in order to evolve together somehow. That's how I feel. What do you think about this?
Well, I mean, I don't think that the cactus or the mushrooms or the ayahuasca is evolving. And I guess I would say that, there may be a lot that we can learn about understanding plant entities and plant teachers, etc. I mean, I'm not going to discount that there are spiritual beings. To me, that's not a necessary hypothesis to explain a lot of the dynamics of shamanism and psychedelic use. But your example that you bring up is a very good one, and I'll just sort of maybe give you a kind of a closing point and elaborating upon the notion that what these psychedelics do is that they, on one hand, remove our higher level ego. They interrupt the prefrontal cortex, they interrupt the default mode network. So the parts of our brain that maintain our sense of separateness and who we are as individuals is being disabled. On the other hand, what the psychedelics appear to do is that they stimulate the innate modular structures of the brain. So, for instance, we have a variety of what have been called innate intelligences or modular intelligences that allow us to engage in certain kinds of mental processes sort of automatically. And one of those things is that we recognize social others. We are looking for a person out there. The whole concept of animism, that nature is populated with spirit beings, is a manifestation of our innate desire and need to find social entities out there that we relate to. We have other mental capacities that are called mind reading. That is to say, we can infer what other people are thinking based upon social context, being in similar experiences, knowing the person. Doesn't require anything like telepathy to infer the thoughts of others. And we have this incapacity that's been called animacy detection. Even other animals have this thing that if something moves, we think there's something there. So we're innately disposed to detect an entity. We're innately disposed to figure out what that entity is thinking. And we're innately disposed to incorporate social patterns. A good example of this is children who are child abused as children, typically become child abusers because they incorporated a child abuser as a social model. So when you take these innate intelligences, the innate tendency to see something live and active, to perceive an active agent, the innate tendency to view that other as a social person, a social member of the species, the innate tendency to model ourselves on the social other, and the innate tendency to infer something about what the social other is thinking. I mean, this complex of innate capacities brought together is spirit teachers, plant teachers, teachers that come from these psychedelics. So to me, the whole dynamic of plant teachers can be understood from a neurophenomenological perspective as how the brain is on one hand being deactivated. The sense of self is being deactivated, the higher cognitive processes are being deactivated, and what we get instead are these ancient, innate modular processes for detecting significant features of the environment that now, instead of functioning separately, they're all brought together because of the integrative brainwave patterns produced by a variety of mechanisms of altering consciousness. So to me, I can give a very neurophenomenological explanation of the wide range of experiences that people have under psychedelics. In fact, I have a paper out that's looking at the ontology of psychedelic entity experiences in evolutionary psychology and neurophenomenology. I think the whole wide range of these psychedelic experiences, entity experiences, can be understood in terms of how the psychedelics have specific effects upon our brain. And so if your readers want to see what I've read, go to researchgate.net. If you have an academic address, you can get an account there and download, probably close to 100 of my articles that I've written about the biology of shamanism, the biology of altered states of consciousness, the biology of psychedelics, the role of psychedelics in human evolution, the role of psychedelics in shamanism in human evolution, how these all interacted to produce an adaptive complex of behaviors that enabled us to, on one hand, more effectively integrate information from the unconsciousness, and on the other hand, more effectively relate to the other members of our social group, including nature and the animals that we get our powers from.
Do you have more 5 minutes? I want to touch on two more things.
Sure,
quickly.
go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Something about the biological basis for altered state of consciousness that you write about. I can relate to it 100% because I always felt like for me, altered state of consciousness, and that's before shamanism. That's I'm talking in my youth, doing drugs and psychedelics and like looking for my way. I feel like for me, it's a biological need to achieve higher state of consciousness. It's not just something I want to do out of boredom or something. For me, it was just as important as having sex, or maybe more. It's a biological need that I experienced. I came to this understanding, but I never heard anybody actually explaining that. Maybe you can just take a minute responding to this, like, where is it in our bodies? Where's the connection between biological and this, higher states of consciousness, which are metaphysical? They are not physical, but their roots are biological. That's how it feels.
Well, I'll try to give you a partial answer to that. First, I will start off saying that experience the alteration of consciousness is as much a human need as sleep or dreaming. These are parts of our normal systemic organismic functions. And so we have to look at, well, why is this alteration of consciousness or this integrative mode of consciousness important? And I'll give you a couple of partial answers. The biggest one is that it's a normal response to deep, extensive stress. So, if you have to run for miles and miles to get away from your enemies, you have to, stay up all night to, keep from getting eaten by animals, you're running out of food for a long time and you're on the verge of starvation. All of these things produce an adaptation in consciousness that enhances the serotonergic functions. So one way of looking at altered states is that they're bringing us to an enhanced functioning of the serotonergic system and maybe secondarily the dopaminergic system. And those two to combine are probably the most important. We also have reason to think that shamanic drumming, dancing elicits the endogenous opioid system. So we're bringing out the system that integrates things, the system that makes us feel good, and the system that lets us ignore pain altogether. So part of why we want these altered states of consciousness is they enable us to extend the ordinary functional limits of these important neurotransmitter and neuromodulatory systems. The second thing that I'll offer why we're driven to these is that an important part of the alteration of consciousness is typically this pattern of extensive stimulation in the sympathetic nervous system leading to a rebound and relaxation response in the parasympathetic nervous system. So it's kind of pushing the body to an extreme and then it collapses. And this collapse state has a variety of advantages. One, it can provide for unlearning, reversal of maladaptive behavior. It also evokes this visionary experience. It's not just psychedelics, but drumming and fasting and meditation and lots of other things evoke this visionary capacity, which is an information integration capacity. I think that there's good evidence to believe that the visual system that underlies dreaming is the same visual system that's being activated by psychedelics and drumming and fasting, all these other things. So what does this visual information system do in dreamings? It is an information integration process. It allows us to integrate information, put the pieces together, get the big picture. So to me, that's the other reason why we're driven to these states, is that not only do they bring us into this relaxed state, but they also provide us with an enhanced capacity to be able to pull the pieces together, pull the parts together, understand the situations that we're confronting, and engage in a form of healing that has to do with psychological release, emotional release, and integration of new ways of thinking about the world that we need to go forward.
Yeah, it feels like a demand. Like my body demands that for proper functioning. That's how it felt to me, always. And the last question I want to touch is, well, when we were talking about this visual region in the brain, or how you call that, something like imagestic, I don't remember exactly the word. When I had my first experience, it was like imagetic. Imagetic, is that right? I'm saying it?
Imagetic,
system.
sure.
So, yeah. So when I had my first experience in the ancient caves in Peru, we were doing ceremonies there, and these are extremely ancient places when you have the rock art of people have birds, and I at this time I didn't know anything about it, but my feeling intuitively was that it was about 40,000 years old thing. It was, I just was sitting there and kind of feeling the people who were doing this as people who were trying to express their inner world, express this visionary experience that we were talking before that you cannot express otherwise. So then when I was looking into it, and I really thought like, yeah, that makes sense because it's about 40,000 years old. So my intuitive perception was right. I just wanted to ask you, what do you think? Do you feel like this was at the dawn of human consciousness when shamanism kind of kicked in and visual experiences started to change our cognition and makes us become artistic in a way? I mean, is that where creativity came to our brains?
Well, I mean, certainly we had experiences long before we tried to record them. I mean, the process of recording them may be relatively recent, but I think that the drive to record these inner experiences was increased by the power of the visual sensations that came from these plants and the mushrooms. That having these internal experiences gave people this motivation to want to externalize them so that others could have some sense of what they too experienced. So, I mean, they may have had these kinds of representations far earlier than we have evidence of. But clearly we know that around 40 to 50,000 years ago, there was a major transition in humans. And it wasn't a biological transition, it was a cultural transition. Anatomically, modern humans have been around 250,000 years or more. But culturally modern humans that made symbols and communicated with symbols, only 40, 50,000 years. Maybe we'll get evidence of a little later, but why at this particular point in time? And it may have been that at this particular point in time, the importance of shamanism as a way of integrating different groups of people became more important. And it was in that context that expressing and externalizing these symbols also became more important.
So where do you feel creativity fits in all these things? Like how we become more creative in psychedelic experience, which obviously happens. But
okay.
What happens in our brains?
I'll go back to the basic model of altered states of consciousness. The first thing that happens, whether it's with psychedelics or drumming, is that we start to take the frontal brain, the prefrontal cortex offline, and we disrupt the default mode network. So our normal, ordinary programs for how we deal with the world are put offline, and the normal ways that our sense of self and identity is maintained through memory is disabled. The normal way of seeing the world is this. On the other hand, we have this enhanced long-distance connectivity between areas of the brain that normally do not communicate with each other. So the parts of the brain that don't talk to one another are now engaged in these intensive networks of global connectivity. We're putting things together that don't normally get put together. Small surprise that we would have new discoveries, innovations, etc. Our brain is basically connected more intensely than it normally is.
Okay, well, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. I would, but you need to go. So, thank you very much, and I'm sure that our viewers would be interested in watching it.
All right, great. Well, they can get the big picture here, but the more recent details, the last 10 years, look for it on the researchgate.net site. Got a lot of articles out there people will probably enjoy reading.
Very good. I will put your book on the screen so people can find you.
All right, great.
Thank you very much,
sir.
Michael.
Sure.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.